Why does my bill keep going up? I'm Tyler. I'm a software engineer and the founder of Workflow Autopilot. I've spent thousands in AI spend across the companies that I've worked with, which are small to medium-sized businesses. By the end of this video, I'm going to talk about what tokens are, what are output tokens, what is usage, how AI cost actually is getting added up and calculated. And then I'm going to go over 5 ways that I've ranked as being the best to worst for reducing your AI spend and making your monthly bill a lot cheaper. And so, yeah, what are tokens? Token is essentially a way to break down English language into smaller bits. So, for more complicated words, you'll have many tokens to represent that word. But for simpler words like the, a, and, it'll be one token. And those tokens are fed into the AI. And that's actually what the vector calculation the neural network's actually multiplying with these tokens and not with kind of what you would imagine characters being for the English language. So what are input tokens and what are output tokens? Input tokens are simply what gets fed into the AI. It's the prompt. It's what you type into the chat window, and it's also the accumulation of the conversation that you've had up to that point and any documents that you may have attached. So for instance, going back to the tokens, if you had one sentence usually you can ballpark it around 25 or so tokens versus a 5-page document being, 2,500, so 2,500 tokens on average. How AI cost is calculated is it's calculated by a hybrid combination of input tokens and output tokens. So they're not always weighted the same or cost the same. So for instance, you might have a $1.20 per million input tokens, but $4.20 per million output tokens. So in many cases, it's true that the output tokens, I'd say in almost all cases, it's true that the output tokens are going to be way more expensive than the input tokens. So examples of the input tokens are documents that you put in, like contracts you want summarized, information about a client or a potential prospect, the anything you put in the chat window for actually instructing the AI to do what you want, as well as the conversation that you've had up to that point will all be going into the input tokens. Since it's a cheaper token, it's way better to front load all your tokens into the input. And so we'll talk about this later when I'm ranking, where I'm telling you about ways you can reduce the cost. But essentially, input tokens are cheaper than output tokens. And so, why is that? Without getting too complicated, input tokens are able to be calculated all at the same time because it has access. You're providing all of the tokens at one point, and that's the prompt that's sent off to the AI. Meanwhile, the output tokens are generated one at a time. If you've ever used an agent, you'll see that it's kind of constructing the sentence as it gives you the output. And that's because it's literally calculating each character, each token as it goes, because it needs to rely on the previous tokens in order to generate the next token in the list. So as far as processing power, it's a lot more complex and takes a lot more power to actually generate the output than it does to read the input. And so that's mainly the reason why the output tokens are more expensive than the input tokens. Right, so number one, model choice. This is definitely the most important one. Every different model will have different usage. When you're looking at the top models like Claude, Fable 5 just released or is re-accessible to the public. And so a model like that's very high end, and its cost, it looks something in the ballpark of $10 per input, and I think 20, 30, or $40 per million output. And so, that's a lot. And a million tokens might not seem to accrue really quickly, but it definitely does. Meanwhile, you have agents like Sonnet or HiQ, and they are marginally less expensive than Fable, maybe $2 per input and $4 to $6 per output. So as far as choosing the model, you want to make sure that you're using the lowest qualified model for the task that you want to do. So if it's a very complicated multi-step task and it's maybe client facing, is very important to get right, you want to maybe use the top of the line model like Opus or Claude or ChatGPT 5.5 or something like that. Whereas if it's not so important and it's maybe used internally and maybe it's just a yes or no answer or kind of a gut check on a summary of a document or something like that, you maybe don't need a top of the line model and you want to instead go for a open source model or something with comparable performance but at a fraction of the cost. For instance, GLM 5.2 is way cheaper and still is a top 10 model. So I think so model choice is really important. And what you want to do is, like I said, use the least viable model for that task. Because if you're starting to spam the really high models for relatively simple tasks, then you're paying for no reason and you're essentially getting the same answer as you would from a lesser quality model. So how would I test this? I would just take whatever model you're using now, look up a chart. Artificialanalysis.ai is very good for this, but it's just a website that compares different models in real time. And so I would start reducing the quality or the power of the model that you're using until it's producing outputs that no longer make sense or are starting to break your systems. And doing that alone can save you thousands. I mean, that cut alone has, across many of the systems that we're talking about, it saves me 3 to 4 times the cost. So we're talking like an 80% reduction in AI spend simply by choosing a model that's still capable of handling that tasks, but it's a fraction of the cost. Okay, so the second most important thing I think is you want to batch your requests together. I'm going to in contents of the ChatGPT client or something like that, chatbot client. You have a conversation open and you begin kind of, maybe you start by inputting this a big contract that you want summarized. The chat will take in that document, it'll tokenize it like we're talking about, and then it'll use everything it knows about you and put that all into the request. That will be your huge input, and that will cost 10,000, 15,000 tokens, right? And maybe at the end, what you actually type in is, I want this summarized. And so when you actually submit that prompt, what you instead want to do is start batching your requests together. So you want to say, I want this summarized, then I want this ordered from 1 to 5. Then I want you to do a little research on what the best aspect of this part of the report is and like how it can be better improved. And then finally, I want you to write an email back to back to the lawyer, back to the client or whatever, asking any follow-up questions that might want to be asked. And what you do by grouping these prompts and these commands in is that instead of every single time you ask it to do one of those things, it has to re-summarize the document. It has to re-put in all the tokens in the input box. And what that ends up doing is that's costing you money every time for every prompt. So I think batching is very good. Putting in all this stuff into the input box like 10 times for each command, you're putting it in once, and the agent is able to go through your list and do it one by one. That again. Number 3, turn down thinking or turn off thinking entirely. So what thinking is, and is some models that you're able to actually turn on this thinking function. And what it essentially does is the AI will take its output and actually reread it and make sure it aligns to what the prompt is. And what we see is that this is okay, but all of the thinking that it does is done in the output box, right? So like we mentioned before, with output tokens being more expensive, now the AI, the model is actually doing its thinking in the output window. So when it does all of its thinking in the output window, it's going to be costing way more than if it did all of the thinking in the input window, like it's like how it would usually work with thinking off. So this kind of goes back to picking the right model. But once you're in the ballpark of what model you want to use, you can go ahead and then experiment with a high level of thinking, then the medium level of thinking, and then low level thinking, and basically keep going down until it's no longer producing the outputs that you want. And that will dramatically reduce your costs. One you can do without even thinking at all. Tell it to be precise. In the prompt, in whatever you give it, whatever kind of answer you want it to return to you, tell it to be more precise. And instead of, I find this is very useful anyway, because AI is a master of turning a mountain into a molehill. They'll just like give you a whole essay to read when you wanted a one-line response. So tell it to do that. Tell it to process it beforehand, condense the idea into one paragraph or a few sentences. By telling it to actually reduce and concise its answer, it's producing less output tokens, which are more expensive. So by producing less of them, it's costing you less. Right. Number 5, new chats and threads per different tasks. I'll be a little hesitant by saying this one because I think people can go overboard and they'll create a new thread or a new task per different command that they want to give their chat. But let's say you're working on one project, right? You have this project and you want the AI to understand it first and then help you make changes to this one project. Some people might say you need a new task or a new chat window for each time, but what you don't want to do for that specific case is have it reanalyze your entire project every new chat because the context of that project will disappear with a new chat. But what you do want to do is if you're working on this project and now you suddenly change to this project, that's a good instance of creating a new chat or a new session because that will have its own concise context window and it won't be bloated with all the details of this other project, which is just feeding into your input tokens. I think this one's a little overblown because input tokens are going to be way cheaper anyway. Context windows are pretty big. They can get up to 1 million on their own, which is pretty much the limit of what we're talking about as far as costs. So it's important to keep your context windows a little more concise by, starting new chats and new sessions before you switch off subject or switch to a different subject. But if you're working on the same project, don't just keep making new chats because depending on the complexity of your project, your agent might have to relearn the entire project and that'll be using a lot of tokens that you don't want to waste. So yeah, that is 5 things ranked in the order of best to worst for reducing your spend on AI. These are tips we use at Workflow Autopilot every day to reduce our ad spend in our AI usage tokens. And now you can use them too. So if your AI costs are way too high or you're looking to change things up and optimize, I highly encourage you to look at workflowautopilot.com. We have a lot of free content on there, and we also have kind of more relevant for this where are you at in as far as what stage you're at in your AI use and how you have AI implemented in your company. All right, see you next time.